but it's very easy to save the world if you're a profitable organization. It's not so easy to save the world if you're losing money month after month. People talking about delighting customers. Again, it's easy to delight your customers if you've got customers. If you're constantly fighting to get new customers, it's a different story. And if a company is moving or losing money every month, their behaviors, when they're under stress, they behave or they can behave in ways that normally they wouldn't. So this was a big lesson to me. So I started asking myself, what is our purpose within an organization? So how can we have a voice? How can we show that what we're doing is actually adding value to an organization? Because I saw the engineering team as being a high-performing team. We were producing lots of features. We were meeting deadlines. We had an excellent support team. We had excellent collateral that went with our product. But for some reason, that wasn't translating into what the business owners saw as value. And I guess if you're wanting to cut costs, and if you see engineering as a cost center, the very first place you're going to go to in order to cut costs is engineering. Later on, I started going to board meetings. And at those meetings, I would talk about sprint velocity. I would talk about what a great job the team was doing. And the eyes of everybody else in the room would glaze over. They were talking about quarterly sales figures. They were talking about market capitalization. They were talking about profit margin. That was completely meaningless to me. And I was looking for answers so that engineering would have a voice. But nothing was working. So I kind of figured out that our purpose within an organization is probably to help the organization achieve the outcomes it wants, which at the end of the day is probably to make money and keep shareholders happy. It's also, hopefully, to delight customers. But if there's no money coming in, then it's just really difficult to do. So I guess I have to ask myself now, and I would ask the people in the room to have you ever thought about whether or not what you're doing is really helping the company where you work reach its objectives and achieve the outcomes it wants? And if you say yes, then can you prove it? It's very, very difficult to show that what we do as engineers, like how does a line of code contribute to company revenue? How does it contribute to profit? If you write 100 lines of code, are you contributing more to profit than you are if you write one line of code? If you write 100 lines of code, are you contributing more to your company's outcomes than if you write no code? It's an interesting situation. So going forward from this, I started looking at best practice. And initially what I thought was, if you're not doing all of these things, basically every dot here, and I can't read it anyway, so I guess you can't. Everything here is what we should be doing if we're a good company, right? Every single thing here is a best practice in the agile world. I mean, seriously. I have the utmost respect for whoever put this diagram together. It's now a couple of years old. It's probably now not just the London tube station, but every tube station in the world. You would drive yourself around the twist if you were trying to implement all of this. And again, some of this stuff, am I a better person because I'm doing some of this? Absolutely not. We put ourselves under so much pressure, Company X is doing this. They're very, very cool. Maybe we're a bad team because we're not doing all of these things. I can tell you here that in my experience, this stuff is completely meaningless if you're working in a company that's got big problems to solve. They're potential solutions to problems, but we can't do them just for the sake of doing them. At exec meetings, the only time that I came across a situation whereby people actually cared about, let's say, even the number of bugs, was when they started to impact revenue. Before that point, there was always a higher priority for that company to address. So a couple of months ago, I posted something on Twitter, and I said, okay, folks, so if you have a beautifully crafted user story, and if you have a beautiful architecture, you've got an exceptional design, you've got really nice, clean code, you've got incredible unit tests, lovely integration tests, everything is beautiful, you can deploy quickly, and you deliver it, and nobody wants it and nobody uses it. Is that a good feature? And I was really surprised. People got back and said, oh, no, there's no way I would ever let that happen. Of course it's not a good feature. I would speak up before that point, and I would say, this is not a good feature. And then I saw this. So somebody's telling fibs, right? So we seem to have this thing about vomiting out features. You know, we've become feature factories. We vomit out process improvements, but without actually understanding what the value is, what is the outcome we want to achieve, what is the problem this feature is going to solve, what is the problem that this process improvement is going to solve, then you know what, we're wasting time and we're wasting money. And we're adding unnecessary complexity to products, and that's definitely not going to delight our users. So on my journey, I was looking for some way to bridge the gap between engineering teams and the business, or vice versa. And I actually came to the conclusion that what I had been doing by, I guess, choosing pet process improvements and implementing them was I was the tail trying to wag the dog. I was taking a potential solution, and I was trying to come up with a problem that would solve. I should have been doing the other thing. I should have been doing it the other way around, because the companies I worked in, they had enough problems. And we had a team of problem solvers, and they were more than able to solve problems. And yet, we didn't tap into their brains, and we didn't say, hey, I've got a problem. Can you help me solve it? And I see that an awful lot. I mean, we get into software because we like tech. But I think more than that, we get into software because we like solving problems. And then we find ourselves working in development teams where we do what we're told, and we somehow become fearful of questioning. But that ability to question is what makes us superb problem solvers. If we have the courage to question, then what we implement will be so much more powerful and so much more usable. So I came across this concept about 12 months ago called Mobius, or the Mobius Outcome Delivery Loop. And it is I'm pretty thick, so I don't come up with ideas of my own. But if I come across someone who's got a really good idea, I steal it. And I kind of think, that's really, really cool. That solves the problem for me. So with Mobius, what I really liked about it is it talks about aligning business intent with basically technical delivery or some kind of delivery. And it bridges the gap. So this, for me, was an eye-opener. It was something that I had been looking for years. So I got myself over to London, and I attended training on Mobius, and do you know what? It blew me away. It provided me with what I needed at that particular point in my journey. So what I wanted to do today is share what I got from it with you, and hopefully you'll take away something from it as well. Now, what is Mobius? Okay, so if we take a typical engineering team, what we do is we deliver software, and we keep delivering software, whether it's Sprint, whether it's our Scrum, Kanban, Waterfall, whatever the heck. We just focus on this the entire time, our delivery loop. And it's a bit like swimming underwater, never coming up for air. So the other side of our organizations are the people who decide how much to pay us, the people who sell product, the people who decide on our brand, they really don't give a stuff about what we do. If you go to a meeting with a financial controller, they won't care about your sprint velocity. They won't care about the number of figures. They'll say, how much money is this feature going to bring us? And why is it costing you so much to build it if it's going to bring in this? So what Mobius says is that, hey people, let's spend a little less time on this side. Let's see what's happening on the other side instead. So it's basically coming up for air to see what's happening outside of the engineering team. Right, so the fact that the middle part here says options, I find that really, really interesting. We talk about implementing solutions, but it's only a solution if it fixes a problem. Before that, it's a hypothesis. We think, or we hypothesize, that if we do this thing, it's going to make something better. But how do we measure better? If we don't measure how bad it is at the start, we can't possibly say or prove that what we have done has made a difference. So Mobius says, okay, let's start with a problem. Let's understand, let's use 5 whys, let's dig, let's explore, let's have the courage to ask why, and figure out what is the problem that we are trying to solve. It also asks, who is it a problem for? And probably most importantly, why is it the highest priority problem for us to address at this point in time? Look, the places I've worked, there were always problems. Nothing was ever perfect. But in those environments, there was always one problem that came to the top. If I'm working on something that isn't a priority for the organization, then it's going to be exceptionally difficult for me to prove that it's valuable, and it's going to be very difficult for me to get budget or time in order to actually implement whatever hypothesis I've got. With outcomes, so outcomes, if you know things are bad, come up with a way of measuring how bad they are. It could be, I'm not necessarily talking about metrics, but metrics are good. I'm talking about some way for you to evaluate your starting point in this loop. Because if you don't know what that is, it might be the number of WTFs a customer says after you deploy code to them. It could be sales conversions. It could be anything. It could be the length of time, perhaps. Maybe we're taking too long to get changes into production. But it's very much dependent on the context. The outcome, how we measure an outcome, is dependent on the type of problem. And it might be that once we have actually come up with a solution for the problem, we throw away this outcome and we start measuring something else. The next, what else can I say about discovery? Right. Okay. Constraints. These are interesting. Sometimes within organizations we say we can't make that change because of something. We can't make this change because it's always been done like this. We can't make a change because the CEO won't approve it. We can't change our way of working. If we reframe that to we could if, then suddenly that constraint stops being an obstacle, and we can again focus on the end goal. It's a very, very powerful tool, and it helps us again to get to the core of the problem that we're trying to solve. Customer outcomes and business outcomes. Ideally, these will be the same thing, but not necessarily so. And with Mobius, it doesn't matter which one you choose. You can do both, but you probably do want to choose one at least. And then the enablers and influencers. So who is going to help you with this if you can't solve it on your own? with the options in the middle, if we look at that. So basically, we all have pet options. So how many times have you worked in an organization where, let's say, the level of quality that gets into testing isn't up to scratch? Now, very often you'll hear people say, we need to do better unit testing, right? That's often a pet option. What I would say to you is throw it out, get it out of the way, and actually explore potential options with others. And force yourself to evaluate these options in the cheapest, easiest way you possibly can. So to evaluate an option or to evaluate a hypothesis, we can do some research in it. We can potentially run a very, very short experiment. Or we can do some investigation. And based on this, we can come up with a score for each option. Now, something that I've used with Mobius is basically for every option we come up with, we give it, we look at it in terms of how easy or hard it is to implement, how confident we are that it'll have an impact on the problem, and how easy it is to implement it. So what we'd normally do is we would rate each of these from 1 to 10, and then just add up the numbers. But I'm sure, here, you probably have your own way to evaluate options and to prioritize. Options, okay, so dogmas. Again, they're interesting. So companies will say you can't do that. And we have these inbuilt beliefs that Sarah Mills from the Financial Times, she calls it the ceremony of process. Sometimes we have a certain ceremony around how things should be done, but sometimes we can remove or we can change our ways of doing things and there won't be any negative impact. But the longer we're in organizations, the more these dogmas become embedded, and then it's more difficult to change. The others, if we go back to this side of the loop, so basically our delivery and learnings. Now this can basically be the shortest time frame possible. What's the cheapest, easiest experiment we can do in order to see that the option is moving us closer to achieving an outcome? When we've used this, we've used basically a time period of 5 days, but it really depends. What you want to do is you want to be as lazy, but as smart as you possibly can in order to get answers quickly. It's pointless going around this loop over and over and over again if it's not having any impact on the problem. Now, I think, are you feeling vocal? I'll ask again. Are you feeling vocal? Okay, right. Let's have a little bit of fun. Right, let's try this. Okay. I want you to help me write a user story. Right. Let's get stuck in here now. Now, this is something that Gabrielle Benefield does a lot. As an Øredev attendee, okay, I need a coffee so that I can stay awake. Right, user story comes into a team. What do you think of it? Is it a good user story? Simple one? How would you test it? Sorry, what's that? Was there? Yeah, okay. So what's the important part of that user story? Yes. Okay, so how would you test that you're staying awake? And we're not allowed to use tasers. So how do you test if somebody's awake? Yeah, you could ask a question. Anything else? Yeah. Anything else? Yes. You could also pinch them or kick them, perhaps. Why do you think you'd want to stay awake? Yeah, to attend, okay. What about the coffee bit? What about coffee? Is coffee going to help you learn? Is there anybody here who doesn't drink coffee? Ha! So you'd be rightly pissed off if you got this. If somebody gave you a coffee and said, "I want you to learn here, have a coffee," it wouldn't help very much. So, if ultimately we want to learn, then this is the wrong solution, isn't it? So, what could we use instead of a coffee? Games, yeah. Anything else? Yeah. I like that one. The last time I talked about this, someone suggested drugs. Now, they didn't tell me what type of drugs, but I'll go with that. So, what you've just seen here is that by opening your minds, you've basically been able to see that this user story isn't that great, and that it's not going to solve the problem that the user wants us to solve. Now, Mobius is about this. It's about allowing you to ask these questions. So, if we go back to the presentation, here we go. Right, so we've had our coffee. Right, let's say in the workplace we come across this situation. Have any of you been in a situation like this before? No? Okay, so let's say something is in production and something really, really bad is happening. And we get called into a meeting. And, unfortunately, this kind of problem is pretty common. But based on this, we need to ask some questions before we can really figure out what's going on. So, if we get a bunch of people in a room and we say, okay, we're having production problems. Is anybody here in DevOps? Okay, what question would you ask? Or what would your hypothesis be as to what's causing production problems?
Well, I would look at error messages, so look at the data I'm getting
Okay.
from my systems.
Okay, is there any tester here? Okay, how would you approach this?
This one.
Yeah. So.
You mean the question?
Yeah. So basically, something is happening in production, a customer isn't happy, they go to you for help.
Yes.
So how would you...
My question would be
Sorry?
My question would be to the customer, what is the problem with your experience?
Okay, so you'd ask about customer experience.
Easiest way if you repeat the question, so they can hear it.
Okay, sorry.
Or otherwise we have to go.
Okay, right.
Somebody says repeat the question.
Okay, right. So my question is, what would you do in this situation? And what I'm getting from this is that depending on what our role is in the organization, we'll approach the investigation in a different way. We'll each have our own hypothesis. So if we have a production problem, if we have a performance engineer, they'll want to investigate it probably from a performance perspective. A usability person will say, perhaps the customer is unhappy because there's an issue with usability. The training person might be asking themselves, I wonder if they've received the right level of training. But then if we bring the business into the equation, they might say, that customer, they're just pulling our leg. They don't really want to use our product at all. They've already selected a competitor's product. So it's important that we get the full picture and decide what to do next. Now, last January, we got a phone call from a client, and they said to us, we need you to come in, and we need you to set up an automation framework for our regression tests. And I thought, okay, that's good, because that's what we do. So what I thought then was, okay, so they're telling us they want us to implement a solution for them, but we don't understand what the problem is. So we went to their office and we used Mobius and we ran a discovery workshop. Now, we learned an awful lot from that discovery workshop. And rather than looking at this, I'll take you through what we discovered. Right, so basically, the way the team worked, they'd started off many, many years ago with a single product. And over time, that product had increased in complexity. And as it increased in complexity, they split it into a number of products. And each of those new products had its own product team. And with the new product teams, each product team effectively became a silo. So they lost, even though this was a financial organization and there was a single financial transaction that was starting and going through each of these products and coming out the other side, they'd lost the link between these products. We learned that they were releasing into production every 4 weeks. And during those 4 weeks, they had two 2-week sprints. Now, for the testing team, the first sprint was testing user stories. And if they were lucky, then towards the last 3 days of the second sprint, they'd get time to run regression tests. We also learned that when we dug in more, the real problem that they were facing was that they were being squeezed. They were unable to test each customer's configuration during the 4-week release cycle. And then their sales team had sold the product to, I think it was another 8 customers, and they hadn't a hope of being able to do that extra work. What they also told us was that the changes being made for one customer were breaking the environments for other customers. And they told us that for the test team to actually set up environments and get the right level of test data was very, very difficult. We learned that once a year that somebody in accounts drew a short straw, and their job was to come in and basically verify that the figures that were being generated in these financial reports were correct. It was a very onerous task, and nobody really wanted to do it. We learned that there were definitely a number of constraints. The team members weren't comfortable writing code. They said, look, whatever you implement, we're very, very stuck for cash, so we want open source. And they said, we want to use Jenkins. We said, okay, that's fine. So we worked together to look at outcomes. And one of the outcomes we talked about was reducing process time. So basically reducing the amount of time that's taken to execute regression tests. We looked at reducing lead time. Now, for anyone who works in an environment where you do CI, reducing lead time is probably 0. But for this team who are doing manual testing towards the end of a release cycle, lead time was huge. We agreed that we would reduce the time required to set up the environment and that we would help them improve their scripting skills. Now, have you ever worked in a project where there is argument during the project as to, it's a bug, it's not a bug. We need to fix it, no we don't. It's important, it's not important. We thought, look, let's get that argument out of the way before we do anything. So we asked our client to prioritize from 10 to 1, where 10 was the most important thing to them, as to what should drive this automation framework or this potential solution. Now, to them, they realized that there was a very high degree of risk in the fact that nobody was really checking the calculations of the figures. There were certain assumptions being made. They said that was really, really important for them to be open source. And basically, so from 10 down to 1, this was really important for us that any solution would adhere to this. And it was actually very, very useful later on because it did prevent arguments from happening. So these were the measurable outcomes that we finally agreed on. So percentage C, it's taken from Karen Martin's metrics-based process maps. She talks about percentage complete and accurate. We didn't know what was happening downstream for this client, so we couldn't calculate and accurate. So we were looking at basically the number of clients that they would be able to cover during a test cycle. Yeah. Okay, so what did we do? Right. So we had our measurable outcomes for our release, and then we wanted to keep it real. So there were a number of things that we kind of, we hoped we would improve, but because we didn't have figures for them, we left them out of this engagement. And I mean, look, there are a number of directions that this client can go in after the engagement, but it really depends on what priorities they have at the end of it. So we looked at, we went through various options with them. Now, what was interesting about this was the fact that, and for each one we worked out a value for ease of implementation, impact on outcome, and confidence in the solution. And there were certain things that we learned from this. So some options, they ended up being scored quite similarly. But if it were another organization where the temperature, where the culture was different, I think some other options would have been easier to implement. But in this particular organization, there wasn't the relationship between the people who wrote the code and the people who tested the code to enable us to look at improving testing or improving the level of quality prior to it being handed over to a tester. We also noted that there was reluctance from the team to seek help from outside the team. And these are interesting because every organization we work in, the temperature, the culture, you know, the amount we can do, the amount we can influence is going to be different. And we have to take that into consideration. So we went off and we said, okay, we will implement an automation framework. And we said, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put together a skeleton framework. And then we're going to work through your highest priority scenarios. After 5 days, we delivered the first one. And we learned that there were very few calculations actually being checked. So we said, okay, this is good. We know that we need to modify this. So we adapted and we moved on. Some techniques we used, so metrics-based process maps was really, really interesting. So this is at a fairly high level. So basically, we were able to plot out the time and then the tasks and how much time was being spent on each task. Now, we would have done something probably like a value stream map if it were going outside of the QA team, but in this case, it wasn't. We also used event storming. So because this product, or what had started as a product, was then split into multiple products, we wanted to get an end-to-end picture so that we could understand what was happening. So all we did was we took the high-level events, and basically these events became things for us to check. So we had triggers. So what triggers an event? We had the outputs from an event. They gave us the things we needed to check in our automated tests. The high-level steps for the test case were basically our events. And this was really, really useful because we only had half a day to try and get as much information as possible about these products. And while we had people in the room and we had a hell of a lot of whiteboard and white wall space, it was really easy to get this information. Now, during the engagement, what we did was we stopped talking about the number of story points. We stopped talking about the number of things we were putting into each 5-day cycle. And we started instead gauging how much what we were doing was having an impact on the outcomes that we had agreed. Even in terms of upskilling the people that we were working with, we came up with a gauge of, look, I can't even spell the word script, to I feel comfortable writing new scripts. And each week our goal was to basically move this closer to our goal. The same thing with learning skills. And what we found was that people were far more engaged. They could see that they were making a difference. Suddenly, it wasn't like hamsters running around a wheel anymore. We were actually seeing tangible outcomes. And every 5 days, we were comfortable delivering this to a client. Now, there was a little bit of a hiccup about week 14, because you remember I said that open source was a big priority for them. That changed week 14. They suddenly got budget. And they said, we've got a big budget, so let's spend big money on a big tool. And we thought, oh, oops, well, that's 52 person weeks of effort gone out the window. But we said, we put smiles on our faces and said, that's okay, let's still focus on the outcomes. So even though we had to completely change tools at 14 weeks into a 26-week engagement, we still achieved the outcomes. Now, at the end of our 26 weeks, this is what we achieved. Now, I'm not a salesperson. I'm a tester. But this gave me the proof to go to the CIO and for the delivery team to be able to say, if anybody asks them, what are you doing? How are you making a difference to the bottom line? They were able to present this. And suddenly they had a voice. And suddenly they knew what they were doing within the organization. So on top of this, things like the number of checks increased. They no longer need to bring in the poor guy from accounts once a year. There are other things that happen, but keeping it purely based on fact and tangible measurements, this is what we saw. And as I said, these are exceptionally conservative outcomes. Now, to me, the big benefit of going for outcomes over outputs is, at the end of the day, how much stuff we do doesn't matter. What really matters is how we are contributing to the outcomes that a business wants to achieve. We are instinctively problem solvers. So rather than just sitting there and being afraid to ask questions, let's just find the courage to dig in, to explore the real problem, and let's address it. And our organizations will thank you for it. Let's not find ourselves in situations where, just remember the remote control, remember the picture of the TV remote. Let's really try and focus on delivering stuff that matters. Because even if we're going fast, if we're delivering stuff that doesn't matter, then speed is irrelevant, it's still waste. We are doing this kind of thing instinctively. I put figures on it, but I'm willing to bet that everybody in this room is making a difference. And I think it's time for us to make it visible. So all I'm going to say is the key takeaway is explore, open your mind to options, and keep your delivery as short as you possibly can. Thanks very much.